Okay, so on the left, what we can see here is an anatomical representation of the sympathetic division of the nervous system, of the autonomic nervous system. And so what we see is the brain and then the spinal cord. So this is our central nervous system. And then we see that the fibers that are giving sympathetic innervation arise from T1 to L2 of the spinal cord. That's going to be a really important note to make. So T1 to L2 gives rise to the sympathetic autonomic fibers. And then they go out to this really important structure called the sympathetic chain. So the sympathetic chain is a collection of these ganglia, and I'll talk about what a ganglia is. So don't get too caught up on that terminology just yet. And then there's a second neuron that goes from the ganglia, which is the sympathetic chain, out to these various effector organs. So these are all the organs that are involved in the autonomic response. We've got the glandular secretions of the eyes, glandular secretions in the mouth, right? The salivary glands. We've got functions of the lungs, which has lots of smooth muscle. We've got the heart, which is under innervation of the ANS. We've got the liver and the entire GI system, the bladder, the genitalia. On the right, what we see is that the parasympathetic system has fibers arising from a different area of the brain and spinal cord. We've got fibers arising from a few of our cranial nerves, and I'll talk about which ones in a minute, and then a few of our sacral nerves as well, okay? So what we see here on first glance is that fibers coming from different parts of the spinal cord and brain give rise to the different divisions of the nervous system. But both these divisions innervate all the organs in the middle here. Okay. All right, so let's look at the basic anatomy of the nervous system. I can explain what a ganglia is. I talked about that word earlier. Hang on, let's see. Okay. All right, so we got this cross section of the spinal cord. So this is gonna be our cross section of the spinal cord. If you took the spinal cord and you chopped it across the middle and you looked at this cross section, this is kind of what you would see. And we can talk about three different regions. We've got a dorsal horn, a lateral horn, and then a ventral horn. Okay, so let's just kind of draw this out here. So this is our dorsal horn at the back. This is our ventral horn at the beginning, at the front, sorry. And then here in the middle is our lateral horn. So this is exactly where the fibers of the autonomic nervous system arise from. They arise from the lateral horn of the spinal cord. Okay, so I kind of draw a little asterisk here. Oops. So the lateral horn is where our autonomic fibers arise from. And so the fibers arise from the lateral horn, they escape through the ventral root, and then they travel out of the central nervous system and they synapse at a ganglia. Okay, so this is a synapse happening at a ganglia. So we want to make the distinction here that these fibers have left the central nervous system. So this is central nervous system here, brain and spinal cord. And this is peripheral nervous system out here, which is everything else. And so the first fiber that goes from the spinal cord and out into the peripheral nervous system, we call this the preganglionic neuron. So we should already be familiar with that term. This is our preganglionic neuron. Okay, and preganglionic because this is before we get to the ganglia, okay? So we then synapse onto another neuron, and this is our postganglionic neuron. So, oops. We have this second neuron here, which goes all the way out to our effector tissues. Okay, and this is our post-ganglionic neuron. All right, so the first neuron going to the ganglia, and then the second neuron going to the effector tissues. And I'll come back to the effector tissues and we'll talk about some examples of what those are. Let's look at the area where this synapse takes place. So where the synapse takes place, we call this the ganglia. Okay, anytime we have a cell body that is not in the central nervous system, that is called a ganglia, right? And so the synapse of this preganglionic neuron to this postganglionic neuron is called an autonomic ganglia. Okay, this is our autonomic ganglia. Okay, and then let's get back to some of those effector tissues that we synapse at. So the types of tissues that we talked about as our effector tissues are tissues that we do not have voluntary control of, okay? And those include cardiac muscle, those include smooth muscle, and we have smooth muscle in abundance throughout the body, as well as glands, okay? And then we have some adipose tissue as well, so fat tissue. So these are the examples of where we see these autonomic fibers synapsing and innervating these types of tissues, okay? All right, any questions so far? Any questions so far? Okay. All right, looks like everyone's doing well, okay. So this is basically the general anatomy of how the autonomic system operates. We've got fibers coming from our lateral horn of the spinal cord. Let's make this in red, just so it's really clear. We're going to talk about fibers that come from these other two areas of the spinal cord, the dorsal and ventral horn, but the autonomic fibers always come from the lateral horn. They escape through the ventral root. I'll talk about the anatomy here. They leave the central nervous system, synapse at a synaptic or autonomic ganglia, and then the second neuron synapses out on all of these types of tissues. Now, the collection of these ganglia, these autonomic ganglia, is what we call the sympathetic chain, okay? So these basically form a string going down the lateral aspects of the spinal cord, and collectively we call these the sympathetic chain. Okay? All right. Okay, hang on while I try to figure out how to get rid of this. Okay. Okay, so let's keep moving here. So then we can also move on to look at each of the individual systems. Okay, so that was the anatomy of the autonomic nervous system, and we can move on to look at the anatomy of each of those divisions, and that's what we'll do. So we talked about two different neurons from the CNS. We had a preganglionic neuron and a postganglionic neuron that are going towards those effector organs, and we talked about the autonomic ganglia, which is where those two neurons communicate, okay? We won't touch on intrinsic neurons. These are specifically in the gastrointestinal system, but these are another form of communication between our preganglionic and postganglionic neuron as well. All right, and then we also mentioned these examples of effector organs. We've got cardiac muscle, we've got smooth muscle, and smooth muscle is pretty much everywhere in the body, okay? Your bronchial tree, your GI tract, reproductive tract, urinary tract, and then glands. When we talk about glands, we're talking about salivary glands, your exocrine glands, your lacrimal glands of the eyes, and so on. And then adipose tissue. Now, adipose tissue is only influenced by the sympathetic division. So make a note of that. We'll also touch on that later on, but only the sympathetic system influences our adipose or fat tissue. Okay. So this is kind of that schematic that we drew. All right, and I stress the importance of understanding the autonomic ganglia and how these connect in a chain to form the sympathetic chain, which is an actual structure that you can see in the body. So if you look in the human body and you look on either side of the spinal cord, you'll see sort of a chain of nerves that are going down either side, and that's what we call the sympathetic chain.